Suddenly, we Democrats have a real campaign for the presidency, and you can feel the energy. But our current excitement must be followed by an excellent campaign that motivates our natural electorate. And that electorate depends more and more on Latino voters every election cycle. Yet recently, Republicans have been making gains among the Latino electorate. How will Latinos vote in 2024? More fundamentally, what really motivates the Latino electorate? Today I'm talking with Mike Madrid, a prominent Republican political consultant. He was for years the political director of the California Republican Party. Wait a minute. Why am I talking to a Republican political consultant? I'm a Democrat, for crying out loud. But Mike Madrid is not just any consultant. Mike is a California Latino who has important ideas about what that electorate is all about. And guess what? He thinks we Democrats don't understand Latinos at all. On top of that, Madrid is a determined anti-Trumper in the Republican Party. So think about the personal consequences of that. We Democrats suffer not at all from denouncing Donald Trump. Denouncing him is mandatory for a Democrat. To break with Trump as a Republican means you suffer and suffer a lot. But with the rise of Donald Trump, Madrid decided that defeating Trump was the most important task and became a founder of the anti-Trump organization, the Lincoln Project. James Carville, the Democratic strategist, the architect of Bill Clinton's success, praised the group, saying, "Let me tell you, the Lincoln Group and the bulwark, these never-Trumper Republicans, the Democrats could learn a lot from them. They're mean, they fight hard, and we don't fight like that." Madrid has written a remarkable book on American politics called, in his typically subdued style, The Latino Century. If you want a chance at understanding the coming decades of our political lives, you must read and digest The Latino Century. So I asked him on the political conversation to discuss his ideas about the American Latino electorate and to get his take on the state of the presidential campaign. Welcome, Mike Madrid.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So am I. So could we start off, could you just tell us a bit about your background and in particular, how you became a Republican?
Yeah, it's a great question. I laugh because I'm asked that question quite a bit. It seems to be I have this, different set of anomalous characteristics that, to me at least anyway, seem to work together seamlessly, but in our current political environment seem to be sort of nonsensical. So I grew up in Southern California, little county just north of LA County called Ventura County, in a city called Moore Park. That was really kind of part of the urban sprawl and of the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was the president. Those were sort of the formative years of my coming of age. I grew up in a very strong Democratic family, Latino, a Mexican American, Catholic, blue collar, working class. My grandparents were immigrants from the Sonora and Durango states of Mexico, the northern part of Mexico. And to me, I always, while my parents were not politically active, they were very politically aware. And that meant some very vibrant discussions at the dinner table. In fact, that was kind of required, participating and being knowledgeable about the world and what was going on. And over time, I realized that my parents, I think what they were articulating economically, even from a social perspective, was much more conservative than the party that they were supporting was pronouncing. And that became really kind of, I think, the division lines between most of our discussions. And with the rise of Reagan in 1980 and really Jimmy Carter's weaknesses at the time, I was very compelled by the Reagan message and began my journey through Republican politics at that time.
Thanks. And your book goes into extensive discussions of the Latino demography, of the Latino community, and does detailed analysis of campaigns throughout the United States, state by state in some cases. I would very much like if we could dive deep into the demographics that you lay out in one of your chapters and take it very carefully, because I think, regardless of the turnout of 2024, I'd like to get into that later, but regardless of the consequences of 2024, your observations about Latino Americans and what we Democrats should start learning struck me as enormously important. So, are you okay when we dive straight into the demographic discussion?
Yeah, let me kind of try to paint a picture as well as I can, because there's obviously so many angles and perspectives to this. The first is we need to recognize that about 20% of the American population is Latino and or Hispanic. There is a difference between Latino and Hispanic. The main difference is Hispanic refers to the country of Spain is included, all Spanish speaking countries. Latino is much more of a political term, which kind of emphasizes the more indigenous side of Spanish speaking peoples. And so the Spaniards are not a part of that discussion. That's the main distinction. But about 20% and rapidly growing, 71%. These numbers just came out from the census yesterday. 71% of the US population growth is from Latino Americans, Hispanic Americans. And that's an extraordinary number, but the vast majority of it, overwhelming, like about 80% of that, is US born. So this narrative about immigration, whether legal or illegal, is really not of much consequence in the demographic transformation that's taking place. About 60% of all Latinos are of Mexican American descent. And it's not that that number is so big, it's that every other group is so small. The next largest group is Puerto Ricans, who are 9%, then El Salvador and Cubans, who come in at about 6%. And everybody else is kind of in the low single digits. So when we talk about the Latinization of America, we're really talking in many ways about the Mexicanization of America. Is this U.S. born, increasingly third generation, overwhelmingly English speaking, and not just English dominant, but usually English exclusive by the third generation. Now there's a discernible fourth generation of Hispanics that are over 18. And again, the exponential growth that we're going to see on the voter rolls specifically are of this age cohort, which really defy the stereotype of sort of the Spanish speaking, recently migrated farm worker. You name the stereotype. It's been imprinted on us by both the media and politicians. That is not only a very small share of who we are now, it's the fastest shrinking segment of who we are. And what I wanted to do was put all of this on paper quantifiably, because the future, the next 30 years, are going to look markedly different than the past 30 years. And we're going to have to really undo some of the stereotypes of who Latinos are, where we're headed, what we prioritize. And that distinction, I think, couldn't be bigger than what the media and political stereotype is of my community, of our community.
I remember some years ago, there was a fad almost of arguing that the Latino population was not assimilating in America the way prior populations had assimilated. And depending on who was making that argument, they would make a host of conclusions as to what that meant for our political lives. You don't sound like you buy that.
In fact, but I would add something. There are some very unique characteristics to this demographic transformation. It is a little bit overly simplistic to say that it's just like the Italians, the Poles, the Irish, other sort of ethnic Catholic groups that came here at the turn of the last century at Ellis Island. This is different. It is very uniquely different, in large part because of the size and scope of the immigration isn't comparable. It's so big. It's also very close to the mother country of origin. We've got this border between the United States and Mexico, is the largest border between a first and third world nation anywhere on the planet. And technology has allowed for a more seamless travel, both physically and culturally, to stay in touch with sort of Mexican and Latin American culture in a way that was not possible at the turn of the last century.
One of the words that keeps coming up in your book over and over again in discussing Latinos is the word aspirational. And you even discuss aspirational aspects in what otherwise is a strictly demographic discussion. I don't want to put words in your mouth. What's aspirational in Mike Madrid's point of view?
Well, that's a really good question because aspiration and optimism are two hallmark features of Latinos, at least at this moment in time. And I'm saying that for a specific reason, and that is because we are a decidedly younger community than any other race or ethnic group in the country. The average age of the Latino is just under 30 years old. For non-Hispanic whites, it's about 40 years old. And aspiration and optimism are features of younger people. We are also closer to the immigration experience, and immigrants themselves are far, far more optimistic than non-migrants about their futures and about the idea of America, not to mention our social institutions. So when I talk about aspiration, the idea of tomorrow and the future and the dream of building a better tomorrow is central to the messaging of this aspirational community. And it's also important to set that up in contrast to other demographics. The age cohort of 65 years and older in this country is largely monolithically white. It's also one of the wealthiest generations America has ever produced. It has lived at a time of relative peace and US global hegemony. At the same time, it is recording some of the most negative views of our own country and the most negative views of the future and where this country is heading. And again, the contrast between this younger, browner, poorer, more aspirational demographic and sort of this older generation of Americans, which dominate our institutions and our politics, that contrast, that stark contrast, really sets the stage for the political environment that we're in at this moment. And where older folks who are generally driving a lot of the hyperpolarization and the negativity that has consumed the toxic discourse in our country can only, in my estimation, be ameliorated by a cultural change. And that cultural change is being driven in large part by the demographic change of younger Latinos coming online, turning 18, and bringing a more vibrant, aspirational, positive outlook on the American idea.
In my own life, Mike, I was a Republican and volunteered for the Army and ended up in Vietnam. Came home from Vietnam, a Democrat, very angry and very much thinking that four presidents in a row had lied to us and had done great harm to my generation. Do you see the Vietnam War as kind of the turning point for my generation?
I don't know. I mean, I would love to have your perspective and your brain on that. There's no question that the Watergate, stuff, the Vietnam experience were formative, especially for baby boomers. What I believe another large part of the big change, when I'm asked when was the change of sort of this Reagan Bush aspirationalism that conservatism was, Reagan was known as the happy warrior. Like him or not, this was a positive, optimistic person who believed in American exceptionalism and, more importantly, in the universality of the American idea, meaning everybody could be bettered with American values and American principles, not necessarily in a colonial sense, but just in that the fact that every American was endowed by every human being, all of us were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. I
Well,
can tell you,
yeah,
I can
go ahead.
tell you, I can tell you exactly the moment that's changed. It changed on 9/11 when those planes hit the Twin Towers. Is it forever changed not just our country's view of itself and our role in the world, but it changed the Republican Party immeasurably And we began at that moment to see the rise of isolationism,
Hmm.
of protectionism, and unfortunately, nativism, where people that were non white were viewed with skepticism and fear. And that became the dominant characteristic of the Republican Party starting the day after.
Well, you were right to suspect that my own personal point of view was that Vietnam was a crucial turning point. 2 million of us went there, and it had a tremendous effect on my generation in a very, very direct way. But I also think your observation about 9/11 is very true. It has transformed our politics in many different ways.
Yeah, look, we define generations not just by age cohorts, we define them by these very significant moments that are definitive in a generation's worldview. And the Vietnam War was no question one of those. And so, I say with a huge qualification that baby boomers lived at a time of relative peace and prosperity. That may be technically true, but at its most formative part of developing its sense of its own Americanness and America's weakness and strengths, the Vietnam War, one of the most challenging wars domestically, let alone abroad, was unquestionably the Vietnam War. America, again, I'm speaking to somebody who served there, and I appreciate and I'm grateful for your service. But I'm certainly no expert on it in the way that you are. To understand just how,
Well, you know, I had a somewhat limited perspective. It had depth, but not breadth.
yeah, well, I mean, my father, and I mentioned this in the book, my father served in the Navy. He served on board with John Kerry, in the South China Sea. And one of his jobs was in part to oftentimes to go in as close as they could to the coast to remove the bodies of dead American soldiers. That has a profound effect on a 22-year-old man, and what his country is doing right and what his country is doing wrong, and questioning whether or not we should be there in the first place. And Vietnam was a definitive moment in the politicization of the baby boomer generation, as it should have been. And it made us question things about our government. To your point, the printing of the Pentagon Papers, it was beyond parties. It was Kennedy, it was Johnson, it was Nixon. It was a structural problem within the United States of America.
Four
And
presidents, two political parties lied to us.
yeah, well, there you go. It's systemic, and that I think is very alienating to a younger generation who, again, unfortunately, at that as we were just talking about, at that point in your life cycle, aspiration and optimism should be a defining feature. When you find out that people of your generation are dying for no good reason, and your government has been lying to you about it systemically for decades, that optimism turns quickly into cynicism.
Yeah, to continue to hope that personal biography can shed light on the politics. When I came back, I was personally very angry and I moved to the left very rapidly, but I could never indulge in the kind of extreme rhetoric that began to find its way into ordinary parlance, find its way into academia, that America was a fundamentally flawed nation, racist to its core, engaged in worldwide domination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that, however, I think you're right, became a kind of narrative in my generation, and it troubles me to this day that. Well, we were talking about Reagan a moment ago. I remember conversations with Democrats. I was active in the California Democratic Party when Reagan was president, and the standard view was, what a stupid man, because he accepts all of this nonsense about how exceptional and wonderful the country is. We know better. We see through the facade, et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at that and found, even as a Democrat at that time, I found Reagan very attractive. This was your description of him is very much like my feeling about him. I just didn't cross over into becoming a Republican.
Yeah, and we used to call some folks Reagan Democrats back then because
Sure.
a lot, not everybody did cross over, but there was a compelling message, and in many ways, as I say in the book, Latinos are essentially the new Reagan Democrats. They're working class folks. The most of us have not, unfortunately, gone to college. This is the blue collar working class essential workforce we called the community during COVID. That plays by the rules in Clinton speak. Tend to be a little bit more spiritual and have faith and faith tradition and backgrounds around the church community. Although they're not socially conservative in a political sense, they're traditionally conservative in a play by the rules sense, so that your children can have a better future than you do. And as long as that social construct exists and there's a belief in it, they're not people. We are not people as that are necessarily looking to get rich someday. The richness is found in the success, the gradual generational success of our families. And as long as we can earn a good day's pay for an honest day's work and save and buy a home and maybe send our kids to college and take a vacation, that's a good life. And that's what has made America, this bedrock institution for so long. And I think a lot of folks, unfortunately, are seeing that slip away, and they're not seeing either party addressing it in a way that meets both their, again, aspirational ideals of who we are, nor our economic concerns that are getting more and more pressing and feel more and more
Yeah.
insurmountable.
Yeah. Let me just push back a bit because the your description of today's younger Latino population sounds exactly like my mother and father and my grandparents on both sides of my family. These are folks who I'm entirely all my grandparents emigrated to the United States. Some from Italy, some from Denmark and England. And your description is exactly accurate. Antonio Nuzzo emigrated here. His ambition was to do, his ambition, to be bluntly, in the short term, was to earn money here, get on a boat, sail back to Durezzano, Italy, show off like crazy on how much money he was making, get on a boat and come back to America and do it all over again. But in the process, to raise a family and to have Rocco go on from being the son of a wire mill worker and become a certified public accountant in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Rocco's son would be named Wallace and would go on and become a lawyer. That everybody in the family knew that drill. That was the way our family was supposed to work. And so what your description of Latinos is really meat and potatoes for that generation. But I do agree with you. There was a generational shift after my parents, my generation, in which there was a loss of hope, a loss of pride, and a feeling that the country had fundamental flaws that it could not overcome. I really don't agree with that. I really think that's a temporary passing thing. And your book interests me because it is so hopeful.
Yeah, and I'll be honest. I did not expect to write an as optimistic and hopeful a book as it began to reveal itself about two-thirds of the way through.
Hmm.
The book was originally intended to come out at this time. It's only been out a few weeks because I was so deeply concerned about the Democratic Party losing Latino votes, as I saw during the Lincoln Project in 2020. I wanted to literally write a book that would give the party an understanding of why it was happening, what states it needed to focus on, what messaging it needed to convey, literally a blueprint to say, can you guys get this together before we lose this election and maybe lose the country, right? There are some very strong strains of this being exactly like your family's trajectory from Italy. There's no question about it, and that's the beauty of the American idea of this welcoming place, or at least put welcoming in quotes, right? I'm sure your family has got some challenges too, but those challenges were never
Oh,
more of never more of an obstacle than the hope that it had for the future being better, and that's what it focused on.
yeah. Well, the family, yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, the family was my Italian family was named Nuzzo. Antonio jettisoned Nuzzo for Knox because of anti-Italian discrimination. My dad, Rocco Nuzzo, jettisoned Rocco for Richard and became Richard Knox. And I told this story once to the Italian American Society in Los Angeles, and Rocco Nuzzo names his son Wallace Brotherton Knox, and the disguise is complete.
Yes. And that's an American story, right?
Yeah,
And part of that is, again, he only does that because he has this deep seated belief that America, despite its flaws, is a better place than not. It's a good
absolutely.
place to be. And it doesn't have to be either or. I believe America is an inherently good, beautiful, exceptional place. But what makes us a good people is accepting that we have those flaws and working to fix them. It's not ignoring them. It's not pretending that they don't exist. The America first, America love it or leave it, that mentality is, it's almost like, an alcoholic not looking at their being self-aware to understand they've got problems to fix. Doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you less self-aware.
Now that
And that's
sounds. Go
that's
ahead,
what
please.
that's how individuals and nations achieve greatness, and that's what I think is happening at this moment. And sometimes it's overdone, sometimes there's an overcorrection, but there's this realization that as good a people as we are, which we are, as good a nation as we are, and we can be better if we are honest about those flaws and work to ameliorate both past problems, but more importantly, provide a policy framework for a better future.
Now here's the pushback on that from me is not that I disagree with you. The pushback is that's a difficult message for either of our political parties currently, and you discussed this. Maybe not in the words I'm going to use, but certainly the hopefulness of that message is one that among Democrats will be very hard to stand up in front of 1,000 Democrats and say without being mocked, without being chastised, without being accused of papering over too much. And on the other hand, among a Republican group would be totally unwelcome. Um, where do we go from here, Mike?
Well, I love the way you set that up because I think you're exactly right. And I was smiling as you were saying it because what I just articulated is exactly how Latinos feel. We get that completely and intuitively. Latinos, by definition, are both indigenous and European. We are a blended culture, a blended people. And we understand intuitively both sides because we navigate that world precisely the way as you and I both described it. So there's no mocking on that. The partisans may do that, and that's why I wrote the book. Is Latinos respond to that and understand that intuitively. It's literally the framework through which we view the world. What I'm urging Latinos to do is to stop being lulled by the siren song of both parties and starts defining our own agenda along those lines. And once that happens, numerically, if for no other reason, both parties begin to have to accommodate that message as a matter of survival. And again, just Latinos are the moderates in both parties. We are much more economically focused than the average Democrat who is consumed by these cultural issues. We are much more racially and ethnically sensitive than the average Republican who is choosing consciously to ignore the reality that America is changing or actively working against it or fighting against it. But the math, Latinos are larger than the margin of victory will larger than the margin of victory will be in every single one of the swing states in November. Every single one. There are 4 million more Latino voters now than there were 4 years ago, and that number is going to start growing exponentially after November. So this demographic change is not coming, it's arrived, but we're now going to see the pace of it moving so quickly where you're going to have to address both sides of the equation. And it's why literally the first chapter in the book is titled Beyond Black and White. Is the old racial paradigm where it's one way or the other no longer works. The idea of what a minority is in America is going to be forever changed. And that's going to dramatically change the way the parties approach their constituents and the fastest growing segment of the electorate.
We've been pretty pessimistic talking about the current state of affairs, but what you're sketching there is very optimistic, and it sounds like you foresee the possibility of a virtuous competition between the two parties in which each party tries to outdo the other in its appeal to this optimistic group of Americans.
That's precisely right. And I don't want to be too Pollyannish. I've been in politics too long to be that optimistic.
Yeah.
But what I will say is whether it's virtuous or not, I think that's the net effects. And that ultimately will result, that competition will force us away from the cultural extremes that have energized partisans in both the right and the left. Because again, most of what we talk about in American politics today is about cultural issues. We're no longer talking about the size of government. The Republican Party, Donald Trump has never given a speech on the virtues of smaller government and how it makes us a better people. I mean, he's a statist. He believes in using the power of government to force his enemies to kneel or to, drive society in the direction he wants to see it. That's not the way we have known the American right to be for the better part of our lifetimes. What I'm suggesting is that's not going to be the future as more and more Latinos occupy the voter rolls. And it seems a little bit, seems to be a dichotomy there as more and more Latinos are moving to the right. Like, how can you say both of those can be true, Mike? And the answer is this. Most of the appeal of Donald Trump is not where most Latino voters would be without him. And let me try to clarify that a little bit more. If you look at people like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, Doug Ducey, the last Republican governor of Arizona, and Brian Dahle, the Republican sacrificial lamb who ran against Gavin Newsom here in California, they all have one thing in common. They all did better with Latino voters than Donald Trump. Think about that for a moment. All of these Republican standard bearers, including, by the way, every single competitive House district where a Republican holds a seat, they all did better than Donald Trump with Hispanic voters. That means Donald Trump is not bringing them to the Republican Party. It means Donald Trump is restricting what would be even bigger growth to the Republican Party. It is precisely his vulgarity. It is precisely his negativity. It is precisely the nativism that is preventing bigger shifts. And that's where I focus. That's where the future is telling me this is all going. And to me, that's a much more optimistic way to look at what is happening as we change our American identity.
Well, here we are talking about Donald Trump. He must be very happy. He has more people talking about him. Walk us into the creation of the Lincoln Project.
So in December of 2019, I got a phone call from somebody who I knew on social media, and I knew his father, Rich Galen, who was basically Republican royalty in the 1980s. He's kind of an insider's insider, but Reed Galen gave me a call and said, Mike, there's a group of us, about 8 of us, if you join, political consultants who are going to start an effort to take on Donald Trump. You'll remember at this time, we were gearing up for the first impeachment hearing, and the Republicans in the Senate were basically announcing that they were not going to allow the testimony or the evidence to be allowed in testimony as part of the impeachment hearings, which is horrifying to think of. Basically, they would not allow the tape recorded call where Donald Trump is threatening Zelensky to not give him arms against an
Right.
invading Russian army until he digs up dirt on Joe Biden.
Yep.
And so we realized a lot of the people that we'd helped get elected in the Senate were complicit in this. And it had gotten to the point where it was only going to be Republican consultants who were going to be the moral backbone of the Republican Party. Like that's how bad it had gotten.
No, I'm sorry. That's,
Yeah.
I mean, even for Democrats, that's a stretch.
Well, yeah. So that's where we were at, and we decided, yeah, let's it came at significant sacrifice, as you mentioned in the introduction. I lost not only a lot of people who I thought were friends, the best man at my wedding, the godfather of my son, 30-year relationships. I lost a tremendous amount of business, not to mention the death threats, people visiting my kids on their college campuses and letting them know that their father was involved in stuff that they shouldn't be involved in. I mean, the list goes on and on of what we endured. But the decision to turn on somebody from our own party was not a difficult one for me. It proved to be a very difficult one for 95% of the Republican Party. And to me, that was a story about how much, not just title and reputation and money and influence drives our day-to-day activities and behaviors and moral code, but our own identity and sense of community is, we were ostracized and pushed out from everything that we had known and invested our lives and our professional careers into. Were gone, and not only taken from us, but we were chastised for it. We were ostracized and we were attacked. And that of course, after the initial rollout, the initial blowback, the support level for what we were doing, exploded. And Democrats, of course, loved us, and I think we were putting out some of our best work as professionals, both from the creative and message content, but also from the data, the analytics, the targeting, the polling. You had 8 people who were performing, I think, at their very, very best, knowing the stakes, how high they were, and I think I'm honored and grateful, and it will be a highlight of my personal life and professional life to have been a part of a very successful effort to accomplish the goals that we did to help unseat somebody who I think is a very toxic part of the American story.
I really found your description of how the project focused its efforts and what its tactical efforts were, how the tactical efforts were structured. Can you give us a taste of that? I think folks listening don't have a real sense of how you operated and how carefully you had thought through what you were doing.
Yeah, most people, it's kind of like an iceberg, as Rick Wilson, one of the other members who I think a lot of people know, kind of a real parched-tongued, operative who's extraordinarily gifted on the creative side of things.
A lot of energy there.
A lot of energy, a lot of fierceness. A guy who just is going to march into the hail of bullets coming at him. And Rick and I have a great personal relationship, but he was doing his best work. I mean, the creative content that we were putting out was extraordinary. And that's what really captured the imagination of the country. It's not very often that a PAC becomes part of popular culture. This, I don't think that's ever really happened, but this did. And that was not, my purview. My purview was to do the boring data analytics that was going to give us the roadmap to actually win the race, or at least deliver on the Republican side of it, which was necessary for Biden to win.
Well, I like the boring analytics, so give us a taste of that.
Well, and one of the anecdotes I bring up in the story is people have to remember this was in the middle of COVID. And I knew that I only had 4 or 5 young guys, all of them under 25, 26 years old, who had never really done races of this magnitude. And I needed to have a fresh look at the data. And so we hired, COVID shut down the baseball season, which means a lot of sabermetrics guys, a lot of the real hardcore data guys were out of work. And so we hired a guy who worked for the Mets, Spencer Harrison, who became kind of my right hand on the data stuff. And he really opened up my eyes on how we could look at things differently And one of the things that we did, we did three unique things. One is we really focused on the Sunbelt states. Arizona, we were in Arizona early saying Arizona is winnable. We should be investing in Arizona, and Georgia also. We were the first, pack in there spending millions of dollars saying we can win this, we can win this. And we ultimately did. The other is we had some very unique strategies related to actually tracking the coronavirus itself. We could see from some of the data where these spikes were coming, and we would literally message in a strategy we called buying into the spike, where we would go in and literally message that shutdowns in hospitals were coming because we knew that was going to happen a couple weeks before the virus took hold, and then when it would, our messaging would stick even more. And we could see dips in the polling as a result. So we were doing some very, very unique things that had never been done in a campaign before. And in many ways, I believe firmly that the Lincoln Project changed the whole game. It changed the way the modern campaign is run in ways that campaigns even today haven't quite caught up with yet. But when people look back, they're going to understand that a lot of the techniques that they're using are things that we pioneered in the 2020 election cycle.
So, to say the obvious, the coronavirus at this point is raging during Trump's latter stages of his presidency.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So it is laid at his feet.
There's no question. And we helped lay it there and make sure that people were reminded of that.
And your focus was on how did you narrow your focus demographically?
Well, we all know that, we don't have national elections, right? We have these maps that, this 270 map that everybody talks about. But again, as somebody who does this for a living, I'm consuming, political data constantly and doing races all over the country regularly and voraciously just looking at different polling data. And one of the things that we knew going into that was that this education divide, anybody listening, if you're a political junkie, the term education divide is important to understand the real dividing point in American politics. There's all sorts of other suburban, urban, rural, rich, poor, blah, blah, blah. But the most significant correlation between partisan behavior is whether or not you have a college degree. It's not income anymore. It is based on whether or not you have a college degree. If you have a college degree, the likelihood that you're a Democrat goes up exponentially. If you do not have a college degree, it decreases exponentially, or at least significantly. And so, having said that, what we were looking for were economies where high-tech jobs were growing. And so that made us look at Arizona, Maricopa County, Atlanta, as opposed to, a deep southern state, as opposed to an Alabama or Mississippi. Georgia has a lot of college-educated workers. North Carolina was put on the map. And they also had a growing number of black and brown voters, Latino voters. So you combine college-educated whites with a significant number of Latino voters, and you've got a state that's in contention. At the same time, you have states that are moving out of contention, states like Ohio, which was becoming more Republican, states like New Hampshire, which was moving right. Biden ultimately won New Hampshire, but it's going to be a much more competitive state going forward. Iowa used to be a competitive state. It's now solidly Republican. Nevada, a swing state, is becoming more Republican. So, most of those states have the common characteristic that their economies are not new economies. They're not bringing biotech, high-tech, financial firms. They're old economies. It's agriculture, it's mining, it's those older economies that don't require workforces with a college degree. Sorry about the geeking out so much on demographics, but this is what gives us an illustration of which states are truly competitive. And what we realized from that was that the Sun Belt states were far more Democrat, far more liberal than most people thought that they were, at least more pro-democratic or anti-Republican. And that led us to name the strategy the new Southern strategy, the exact reverse of what began under Richard Nixon in 1970, essentially, in the post-civil rights era, was getting Dixiecrats, white Southern Democrats, to move from their Democratic tradition and start voting Republican, we were seeing the exact opposite in the exact same place. Is there were white college educated people moving into places like Austin, Texas. They were turning the state more purple from its red hue. They were the demographic that was turning Arizona blue. They were the people that were turning Georgia blue. They were the people that were turning North Carolina with its significant financial and biotech industries blue. And that's what the future looks like. It may or may not happen this election cycle, but in 10 years, that will absolutely be the case. Those states that have the higher the number a higher number of college educated voters than the national average will be Democratic states. Those that have lower will be Republican states.
And your main tool, as at least is discussed in the book, was television advertising. Is that right?
Well, there was two. The television advertising is what most people came to understand the Lincoln Project was. But we were doing a significant amount of online advertising. That's where most of our money was put because it allowed us to really hyper focus our message to very, very slim sectors of the voting electorate that we needed to speak to. Remember, we weren't trying to win half of the Republican base. We were trying to get about 5 to 7%. We ultimately got 8, so we overshot a little bit, which was great. But we knew we could win with about 5 to 7% of defection from Republicans from Trump to Biden.
Can you go over that just a second more? Say that one second. 8% of the Republican base?
8% of Republican voters did not vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Joe Biden. That was the critical number in places like Maricopa County, Arizona, Gwinnett, DeKalb County surrounding Atlanta, Oshkosh in Wisconsin, the collar counties around Pennsylvania. Those are the areas we were investing millions of dollars because we knew that if we got between 5 to 7% of Republicans to bail on Trump, we could win the race. And that doesn't sound like a lot. It's not. It's very marginal, but history is made on the margins. This race in 2024 is going to be very, very close either way.
Well, let's use that as a jumping off point. What are your observations about 2024 today compared to what you lived through in 2020? What does it feel like out there for a pro?
That's a great question. Look, every race is a different race. You can't use the same battle plan from the last race to win this one, but there are some straight through lines. So let me tell you what I'm looking at right now. And as we're recording, we're kind of a week past this awful debate that Joe Biden had, which has caused a whole lot of panic.
I hadn't noticed.
Yeah, I know. This panic in the Democratic establishment and the media, a lot of people lighting their hair on fire, running around in circles right now. The basic trajectory of the race has not changed. Joe Biden is behind in the polls. He's been behind in the polls, but the foundational elements of a winning campaign, I think, still benefit his reelection. And what I mean by that is even with such a bad night of debating, he's increased his share of independent voters because they already have baked in the idea that this is a feeble old man. They know that. Voters are no longer voting for candidates. They're voting against visions of the world that threaten their own worldviews. And when you understand that is driving voter behavior, everything changes in your perspective. And that's the way a professional looks at the race. Let me say it again. Voters are far more motivated by what they're against than what they're for. And that's what allows Republicans to vote for Donald Trump, despite the fact that he's a 34-time convicted felon and sexual assaults and, on and on and on, is they don't particularly care about the flaws of their own candidate. They're more concerned about the threat they perceive Democrats pose to their worldview. And it shouldn't surprise us that Democrats are behaving exactly the same way. That's called negative partisanship. And negative partisanship is the dominant characteristic of what is driving the electorate right now.
And the words you used, their vision of the world they want, or their vision of the world they fear. That's exactly what Lynn Vavreck of UCLA said on this podcast some time ago. It's almost poetry, but it's very evocative poetry.
Yeah. Well, and it's true. And I think once you understand that, a lot of the things that seem inexplainable become perfectly clear. It tells you why people are voting the way they are. It tells you why such a horrible debate didn't really shake anybody off one way or the other. And those that did get shaken off will be back in a week or two. We will come back into these cemented partisan lines where for the past 25 years, the variance between the Republican and Democratic Party in the presidential race has been plus or minus 3 points. It's a very, very narrow range. The idea that somehow debates change behavior like it's Lincoln Douglas era, that's really never been true, at least since then, but it's particularly untrue now.
So that is flat out the most well reasoned, optimistic statement I've heard about Joe Biden's prospects in weeks.
Yeah, I mean, look, and again, the data is very clear on this, but we as human beings, we have this need to say, oh, he looks old. People aren't going to vote for him because he's old. But that's not the way this works. And sorry about the laughing, but I find that all the time. It's very common. This idea that people liked George W. Bush because they could go out and have a beer with him. Like these are not. It's like Moneyball. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Moneyball.
Yeah.
When the old the old guys that were out there drafting players would look at is his girlfriend pretty or not? That tells us how much confidence he has. Like those are not quantifiable metrics. That's not real data. And once you start playing the game with real data, it changes everything. And what the data tells us over and over is, yeah, by a wide majority, most people think that Joe Biden is too old and shouldn't be running for president. But if you ask those exact same people if they'll vote for him despite that against Donald Trump, almost universally they'll say, well, of course, I'll vote for anything besides Donald Trump. So they've already factored all of this stuff in. This is not new information, and it scares the media, it scares the elites, it scares the pundits because they're still playing this parlor game that these qualitative issues are what drives voting behavior, when we know for at least the past 25 years they absolutely do not.
So it really is someone runs as a Democrat against someone who's running as a Republican, and the public knows with great certainty what they stand for.
That's exactly right. There's no such thing as, I mean, back in the day when in an elected office, that you could be a pro-life Democrat, you could be a pro-choice Republican. Those creatures don't exist anymore. Like
Well, go ahead,
go ahead,
please.
Well, I was going to say, but more importantly, what is valued in a negatively partisanized environment is loyalty to the tribe more than anything, more than ideology, more than policy differences. It's loyalty because the opposition is viewed as an existential threat to all the things that you stand for, this worldview. And if you're fighting for a worldview, it's very easy to dismiss the deficiencies of your own candidate because they're not consequential. They're not determinative. You don't care.
So let me take us back to one of your other crucial points, which is what you think the distinctive nature is of the Latino electorate and what's going to happen over the coming years with the very exponential growth of the Latino electorate, which you characterized, I don't, am I getting your words correct? Moderate, or of some sort, centrist of some sort. That doesn't, so I hear you saying two different things, that campaigns these days are a matter of saying to the electorate, you know our worldview, the Democratic worldview and the Republican worldview, which do you want? But the Latino perspective, do you see the Latino perspective as different from that?
I do. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's the entire premise of the book. And here's why.
Oh.
People are looking at Latinos as though they're shifting to the right. What I'm saying is they're not shifting at all. They're emerging as something new. These are new voters. All of these third generation voters don't have a vote history to shift from. They may not be behaving like their parents or their grandparents, but they're not shifting the way the white Dixiecrats did in the South, or African Americans did after the civil rights legislation, where African Americans were overwhelmingly Republican until Kennedy Johnson, then they became overwhelmingly Democrat. That's a shift. What we're witnessing now is an emergence. There's a new population of a new perspective that has the weakest partisan anchors of any group in the country. The group that is the most likely to affiliate as no party preference in California are Latinos. We also have some of the lowest voter turnout rates because I would argue the parties aren't selling anything that they're buying. And so as a result, if you look at it as an emergence as opposed to a shift, it starts to make a little bit more sense. And what they're saying is they're rejecting both party platforms. Let me add a little bit more detail to this. And as I said, this movement towards Republicans is happening despite Republicans' best efforts, not because of them. There are two institutions that register very poorly amongst Latinos, despite the fact that we have the highest trust and confidence broadly of almost all American institutions, whether it's the church, whether it's the media, the government, higher education, corporations, the military. Broadly, Latinos have very high levels of trust and confidence in those institutions, much more so than any other racial or ethnic group. There are two that are an exception: the Democratic and Republican Party. And so when you look, they do not believe that these parties are doing anything to further or advance what all these other social institutions are doing. The two American politicians that significantly outperformed both polling and conventional wisdom with Latino voters were Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Nobody has outperformed the way that they have. And the reason is because they're both messaging against their own parties. That is central to their message, is this political populism. And Latino populism is a very strong characteristic of what is emerging, but it's a populism specific to the parties. And I would argue, so I call it political populism. It's a rejection of the two-party system, despite believing in the broader American social institutions. And that's where I think the challenges really are need to be focused by both parties. And again, that's a very central theme of the whole book.
Well, let me ask you to comment on what was also I saw as a central theme, and that is the need for an emergence of an economic working class agenda, to literally quote your words, which were used over and over. Tell us where you're headed with those ideas.
So whichever party is able to capture the hearts and minds and votes of a multi-ethnic working class is going to be the dominant party of the next generation. The Democratic Party has a real problem with the working class piece of that. The Democratic Party still believes it's a working class party, and it's not. And that's not Mike Madrid saying that. That's working class people saying that. The working class people have been moving away from the Democratic Party for the better part of a decade now. The Republican Party has struggled with the multi-ethnic piece, which is why the rise of Donald Trump and Donald Trump's messaging has been so central to concentrating white voters, in large part rejecting the multi-ethnic future that America is barreling down the road towards, which makes the diversifying Republican Party all the more confounding to people who don't understand it. It's like, how can you be, a nativist party that, doesn't want to be diverse, and yet you're becoming more diverse? And so that's the challenge: is can the Republican Party become a more accommodating party before the Democratic Party can get back to its working class roots? And whichever one is able to solve that problem within their own voting base first is going to be the dominant party for the next generation. But they both have equally significant struggles for the exact opposite reasons.
What a vision! No, I'm just thinking about that. The vision comes to mind of the two political parties struggling for dominance and control, and the dynamics within the party moving toward the same thing, some kind of a working class vision that makes sense. That certainly is not where the discussion has been, but you're pretty optimistic about that.
It is absolutely not where the conversation has been. It's been the exact opposite, which is why we've gotten to this polarized, stratified, toxic zero-sum place. What I'm suggesting is that the Democrats are finally realizing they've got this problem, and as Democrats have been consolidating, as when you and I were both younger men and really engaged in politics, if you said rich, old, and white, you were talking about Republicans. Today, right. the richest, oldest, whitest zip codes are not just Democrats; they're pretty much progressive Democrats, right? So look at the coastal counties of California, for example. These are the most rock solid blue counties in the state. That's the same all over the country. And that party, as it has concentrated there, has gotten away from economic issues, bread and butter, working class, hard hat issues, and is now animated by things like abortion rights with the Dobbs decision, gun control, marriage equality, legalization of marijuana. All of these are very legitimate, good issues, but they do not animate working class people. Working class people are worried about paying the rent, about not getting their job eviscerated by environmental regulations. If you go to the construction, can you hear me?
No, I was trying to interrupt you with an observation. You sound like James Carville.
Well, or James sounds like me.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, the two.
Yeah, that's the problem.
That's the two of you are seeing the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And James is right. And we've had conversations with him, and he's been, as you mentioned in the introduction, he's a little bit more saucy about it than I am, in the way James does. I love him for it. But he's right. Is the Democratic Party has gotten away from its Democratic, FDR roots. It's gotten away from, it's the economy stupid was James Carville. That was him. He was saying, get away from the cultural and start talking to working class people with where they live about economic issues. That's what the Democratic Party has to do again, but it's really difficult because it is consolidating white, wealthy, college-educated homeowners, and that constituency couldn't really care much about working class issues. In fact, they often see working class industries as a threat to the climate, to the environment, and they don't want those industries. And working class people know it. So, that we shouldn't be surprised that they're drifting to the right or emerging to the right, because they're keenly aware of that. They're on the job site with these non-Hispanic white guys that were in the diners, economic anxiety, and they're feeling that same pinch. They can't afford a house in California. They can't make a living in California that's sustainable by themselves or with their wives working. It's just not possible anymore. Well, those changes are afoot. As the working class is becoming more Republican. The thing that nobody ever anticipated was what happens when the working class is no longer white. Do they still shift to the Republican Party? And that's exactly what they're doing. They are becoming more Republican.
So it sounds like if you look to the future and you're looking for who emerging national leaders might be along these lines, Gavin Newsom would not be one of your picks. But if I may ask, where do you see leadership arising in each of the two parties that might possibly pursue the agenda you see?
That's a great question. Actually, I think Gavin Newsom, with the way the party sits now, is probably the most strongly positioned to lead the Democratic Party because he overwhelmingly focuses on these cultural issues.
Right.
But your question is, what could lead the party out of the wilderness?
That's right.
And the answer is Ruben Gallego in Arizona, Alex Padilla in California, Catherine Mastro-Cortez from Nevada. Notice I didn't say Amy Klobuchar, Gretchen Whitmer, or Tim Ryan. The DC class thinks that they can still get white, non-college educated, working class voters and the Rust Belt back. They can't. So, but in their typical DC way, they keep focusing on that as the demographic to get them back into relevance, overlooking that same demographic that is brown, not white. They're doing the exact same thing that Republicans did when I said they were Reagan Democrats, except they don't want them when they're brown. They're doing the exact same thing that Republicans did. And that's a huge, huge tactical mistake.
Your book focuses on Arizona for an entire chapter and had the most interesting discussion of Ruben Gallego I've seen so far. Folks should pay attention to Gallego in this race, and when you buy the book, turn to the chapter on Arizona. It's particularly striking.
Yeah, but read all the chapters before it first.
And underline.
And underline. It's a good book to, everybody that's read it kind of goes, I can't believe how much I underlined and highlighted. And
yeah, I got a lot of scribbles.
A lot of scribbles in it. I think it's good to read it with a pen and a pencil just to take notes and underscore stuff. And the feedback has been great. Even people who don't agree with it are saying, this has really made me look at things differently. And that's the point of writing a book, right? Is to be part of the discussion and start jolting people out of these old ideas of who Latinos are, because there is a demographic scientific explanation for what is happening. It's not just vibes. It's not just, Donald Trump is this Pied Piper that's bringing them into the fold. There is a scientific demographic explanation for these changes in voting behavior.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the Political Conversation. It has been an absolute joy chatting with you, and you're shaking up my brain.
Well, I hope so. I appreciate that. And a wonderful conversation, great questions, and thank you for taking the time and having me be part of your show. I really, really appreciate it.
I really, really appreciate you.
Thanks, Wally.
See you.